This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's weekly podcast. Every Wednesday leading up to the American presidential elections, the Polis Project will host activists, organizers, writers, reporters, and progressive voices as a part of our politics podcast. They don't just tell you what happened. Our guest today will inform you about the issues, policies, legislations that matter to their communities beyond the headlines. This podcast is available as both the video and audio formats. Joining us today is Anoa Changa, a staff reporter leading Prism's coverage of electoral justice and voting rights. Prism is a BIPOC-led nonprofit news outlet that centers people's places and issues currently underreported by national media. An organizer by nature and a lawyer by trade, Anoa has been a grassroots digital organizer and strategic advisor to several organizations. Anoa is a movement journalist, deeply influenced by grassroots-led electoral organizing efforts. She's the host of the podcast, The Way with Anoa, tackling politics and current events through a Black progressive feminist perspective. Anoa, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me here.
You do so much, but also you've had a interesting career trajectory. You're a lawyer. Um, you did organizing work, and now you're a journalist. I would love to hear all about how you got to this moment after having done all of these amazing things.
Retired officially lawyer. It's interesting. I've been asked this question, like, when did you get radicalized or when did you get into politics? And like, as a child, I grew up in a very strong radical Black household, so politics in that sense existed, organizing and engaging existed in our household. But I think as an adult, my children and I were in West Virginia in 2014, and there was a chemical spill in Charleston, the capital where we lived, and it affected the folks, 300,000 people in the region. And that kind of activated me, Anoa, the adult, with my own adult passion and drive for issues. Now, before then, I was civically engaged. But the most of my organizing experience was like, I was not a soccer mom. I was a football mom. I ran my son's football franchise. So those strategies of, running and organizing 100 and something plus football players and cheerleaders, plus all their parents and coaches, I put that into when we were experiencing work happening around this chemical spill that affected all of us. And I developed adult onset asthma, and like that experience in early 2014 really just got my engines pumping. Like I was like, yeah, like I actually do have the opportunity and space to do something. I'd always wanted to be more politically engaged and involved, but as a young mom and going through school with two children, time wasn't really on my side to do much else. So when the chemical spill happened, that was something that I felt like I could justifiably make time for away from my children. And then coming into the 2015-2016 presidential election cycle, by then we had relocated to Atlanta, Georgia. And I got involved around the grassroots campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders, and working with Women for Bernie here as their Georgia lead, and then eventually becoming their nationwide organizer in terms of organizing all of their different state leads. And then also I was their research team lead, and also was a lead with African Americans for Bernie Sanders, right? So these were digital platforms engaging and building community and organizing in this way for this presidential election cycle. And then through all of that, I started podcasting. Because I started doing some interviews for Women for Bernie, and then I started podcasting, co-hosting at times the Benjamin Dixon show. And then I did run for a while, like a live, regular, weekly, nightly news stream. And that was just a really interesting experience, right? I was mild-mannered administrative lawyer by day, and mom. And then in the evening, I, was doing the politics on YouTube, and it was interesting. I had always wanted to be, more engaged in writing and doing this type of stuff, but just because of the way life went for me, it wasn't really an opportunity or opening. And I think what we've seen in the rise of independent media in the past, several years, and particularly with the way in which how accessible it has become through the technology with YouTube, and now with we're streaming with things like StreamYard. Some of these things become so much more accessible to those of us who do not have access to either the technological background and understanding, or the equipment, the funding to be able to do this. So doing that, working my regular job and taking care of my kids and doing that as my other thing, that became really interesting and gave me an opportunity to then start doing some freelancing. I had written op-eds a little bit in college, but really starting to do more of that over the past couple of years. I was seeing that there was another space, another path. When we're little, I mean, I think I'm the oldest of the millennials, and like, so we were still a part of that generation of kids that was taught that you just grow up, get you a good job, you get a good job with the government, and you stick with it so that you can retire, right? Like that's one of the few positions probably still left where you could have a decent retirement if you stuck with it long enough. And then learning we're in this very different digital space now where people can really start charting their own course. And I started learning more about things like people doing consulting work. And so they weren't tied to a specific workplace, but the value of building their own work. And so while that has not been my complete shift, it did open up a new world of possibility of how I could change my trajectory from I'm a lawyer who had one vision. I already had one vision for my professional life in mind when I went to law school. I thought I was going to be doing affordable housing and like public education. And like I thought I was going to be doing like public interest law in some format. And then in 2008, 2009, we had the crash. I was, a finalist in a position that I really, really wanted with a public, law office. And they rescinded, they weren't giving out decisions until the following May when we would have been graduating. So I would have had to take the bar on a hope and a whim to go move to this state, to this city where I possibly may not have had a job. And again, going through school, with two children, there was no way that I could take that chance. So I opted to go, I took a fellowship in Chicago. I just started out doing public housing and public education law and policy. So very similar to what I originally wanted to do. But that, fellowships are short term. They're really great for getting you out there and engaged. But at that time, it was still very challenging to chart a new trajectory. And so I ended up working for a federal agency, which was not my passion, my love, nor my joy. But, it was good work. It helped me be able to be present with, two growing elementary age school children by that time. And when the opportunity came to shift, because I had been developing these other skills, like I think the other thing that's been remarkable about the past several years is previously it was probably very challenging for folks who did not have traditional experience on a campaign to become so involved politically in any effort before what we saw happening in 2016. With the Obama campaign in 2008, 2012, there was a whole investment in organizers and really helping people step in. And so it's possible that some of that work also laid the groundwork. But by the time we saw 2016 coming around and the way in which the Bernie campaign existed, it did provide opportunities, I think, for people to kind of step in and develop an acumen that maybe had not been as readily available to, people outside of certain political circles. And I'm not going to say that everyone took advantage of that in the same way, those opportunities, but I do believe that there was an entry point in 2016. And we've seen so much more of it now over the past 4 years. But it just was really interesting to be able to develop skills, to start working with several different organizations that were trying to start off the ground in 2016, to be able to put this passion that I had already previously had and this skill set to a different, use, and that people actually cared and that counted as experience. I think, oftentimes we've also been taught that when you volunteer or you're not getting paid, then somehow your work is not still as valuable as the work you're compensated for. It's all labor. It's still all very much your best. So then I was able to transition. And in 2018, I left federal service after about 8.5, 9 years and went into Democracy for America as their city's electoral manager. So managing candidates at the local election level, county and local level elections across the country. I think by that November, I had about 40 or 50 active candidates in seats. And so that was really an interesting entry point into my own understanding of like power and how we shift systems, because so much attention and focus is placed on the presidential, We don't necessarily look at what's happening at the state level, but it gets some attention. But the local level, we often have people more often than not running unopposed, or, most of us are completely unaware of what any of the judges on our ballots even do or what their records are. And so that was a really great opportunity. Like, I learned so much, particularly, for folks who are out west. They may know more about justices of the peace than I ever did, but I always thought justice of the peace was, the type of position like you see on TV where people are running away to get married, and that's where they run through the justice of the peace. I never thought it was like a serious function. But what I learned from interviewing, candidates for office in Arizona and Texas and New Mexico was that, or Nevada, was that, the justice of peace is like the front level, like first entry point to the criminal justice system for some people, particularly when you're talking about juveniles and truancy cases and things of that nature. I had a young person who was running, and that was one of the things that they talked about. Like, this is my way that I can help stop the school to prison pipeline, right? And so, or influence the school to prison pipeline. And so that just continued to help further developing my analysis and understanding of how politics unfolds and works. And I think at the same time, I'm a studier of like people and spaces, right? It comes from, I have a background in city and regional planning. And so I love mapping, right? And spatial awareness. And so understanding like, who are the different organizations, who are the different players and people involved, what are the different trends we're seeing and how movements are growing and shaping. And I think that has led me to this point where I'm now at Prism doing electoral justice coverage, which is a different lens than we've seen in a lot of media. We are seeing more coverage of, progressive organizations and grassroots movement, but it's a different approach. I think it's a more comprehensive approach overall. So that is like very loosely.
No, it feels great.
There's a whole chapter of my life that is called the 2018 elections. But I mean, that's my general like flip, and it's fascinating that I'm sitting here talking to you about it and trying to just think like what made sense and how to put it in order. It's like, wow, that is pretty amazing. But I never considered, everyone would always say when you're a little kid, you'll hear in English class, oh, you're a good writer. When you hear, and you get told like you should be a teacher, right? You should do something else. But like very rarely do I think children of particular backgrounds are taught that journalism and being a direct communicator in this way is actually something that they can do or should even aspire to do. Or it's dismissed as that's something that's never going to pay enough money, which is possible for some, unfortunately, in local outlets that may not have the right funding. But like, there are so many ways that I think the lessons from prior generations constrain our ability to vision or create opportunities, even at times like this, where it does seem like opportunity is lacking.
And also the power to speak to our communities and our people, right? Mm-hmm. And as I kept listening to you speak, I just kept thinking, it feels like you've been training for this very moment, not just for the presidential elections, but just the kind of things that are happening. And that takes us precisely to the conversation I want to have. Mm-hmm. Like so many Americans and those who live in this country, I saw the presidential debate and just seeing the president of this country. I mean, this is not a takeaway from the racial terror that's always hounded Black communities. But to see the president of the United States openly tell the Proud Boys to stand by was, I know we've had this conversation about whether we should have this conversation or not, but I would love for you to, as a journalist, but also as a mother and a Black woman, just seeing that conversation, walk us through what that meant for you.
Yeah. I think really like watching the debate the other night, I had already like talked it through with our digital manager at our outlet at Prism. And I was just like, yeah, I'm going to live tweet the debate. And he was like, oh, I'll stay up with you and do the same. And I didn't want to put that burden on anyone else. But I feel like part of my duty in terms of like what's my responsibility in this moment is the work that we're doing at Prism, is the work that I've been blessed to do, through the electoral justice coverage. And part of that I thought was we already knew what the topics were. We already knew that there were some issues around, Chris Wallace's ability to, or his lack of concern about fact checking, right? We also know that we have a president, regardless of what people's, political alignment would be. We also know we have a president that regularly lies just as he breathes, right? Like it's been documented numerous times how often and at some of the silliest things, or continuing to repeat things even after he's been corrected. So we knew going into the debate that there was going to be issues. I am pretty sure most people in this country, regardless of who they support, would acknowledge that because of the way Trump just reacts and exists, there were going to be challenges, right? There were going to issues. There was going to be some moments. I did not know that those would be the moments we would get, right? I think at that moment, I actually had misheard him. And I had tweeted it out wrong. And I was like, I had to go back and like, oh, I clearly misheard that. And part of my focus was I was so busy trying to figure out how to make sure I was capturing what was happening in the debate. Because I tweeted out earlier today of like, anyone doesn't want to watch, you can just follow my narrative, right? I'm going to live tweet for you. We're all good. And I was so focused on making sure I was capturing things and being as accurate and like putting my own spin, my own framing and stuff, that I had actually missed the exact wording. And then somebody was like, no, he said stand back and stand by, not stand. I was like, he said stand down and stand by. So that was still really bad to me. But they were like, no, it's even worse. And what really alarms me, focusing more on some of the issues around voting rights and voter suppression, particularly being based here in Georgia, was what we've seen around. For me, in my mind, I instantly went to the calls for, the poll monitoring that they want to do. Or, we've heard there was coverage, I think originally it was The Intercept that broke this story earlier this year, about conservatives directly planning to recruit, people with ex-military, militia folks, et cetera, to go specifically to neighborhoods and polling locations in communities of color, targeting Black and Native communities specifically. Talking about Black communities and Native communities on reservations specifically in this recording. And so that type of, effort, combined with the fact that we're talking about now that we are the first presidential election cycle without a consent decree that previously barred the Republican Party from engaging in ballot security activities based on a consent decree that was enacted in the early 80s. So we have all of these things coming together. And we've already seen, militia and armed people showing up in, whether it's at protests, showing up at the state house to demand that lawmakers not take certain actions, or when we saw in Michigan with the demand that people open up right away. I mean, we've already seen this type of interference in some ways, right? So that's what my mind immediately went to. I mean, the second part is this conversation about whether or not he would denounce or whatever. He's been doing this since before he stepped into office, and it just continues to escalate. And there is some really brilliant dialogue from folks about the levels of fascism and where we are and how we need to be prepared for what we are fighting. And I know that journalists, there's a commitment and conversation to objectivity and being fair, but we need to reframe fairness. These are the things going in my mind right now, because it's how is this actually going to be covered? Are we going to treat this as just another thing that he has said? But even in this moment of oh my God, he said, yes, he did. And he's been doing it this entire time. But it's an amplification. It's not a departure for what we've already seen. And I think you acknowledge that some in your opening comments. But when we have, DHS memos being released saying that they were given talking points to express sympathy or say, positive things about Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old who murdered people in Kenosha, Wisconsin. This is, while we may not have seen releases like that specifically have that type of language, even in the emphasis and coverage on how the government surveils and who is prioritized, who is shown sympathy to, that's endemic in this way, the criminal system, the investigatory surveillance process that exists within the United States that has operated. We see cops, even though you have armed militia groups, even though you have white nationalist terrorists on lists as being people of the highest concern in terms of where threats are, you will see police, you will see officials treating them with more respect and dignity and compassion than they do young Black people, young brown people, young people of color who are protesting all across this country, whether we're talking about now or we're talking about 2016 with Standing Rock, and just historically, you will see more compassion because these people are white like them. And whether folks want to admit it, on some level, there is a comfort with those who are more familiar to you because they look like you. And for those of us who exist outside of whiteness, we don't have that same, you know, we don't have the same reliance on comfort. Like our entire existence, it may be in varying degrees, but it's very uncomfortable because we are always othered. And even when we are allowed opportunities to be in certain spaces, even when we are reaching the highest, peaks as presidential nominees, vice presidential nominees, the heads of organizations, they're not even microaggressions anymore, right? There are still those pieces that are built in the system. So these are all the things that go on in like my galaxy brain when this is happening in this dialogue. But that entire section was a problem, like beyond how Trump is signaling, and that is very concerning. And there needs to be a real strategy and plan on how do we safeguard the people who are most vulnerable in this country, because there are a lot of folks who are going to be all right. Again, y'all, this is my brain works this way sometimes. But I was watching not too long ago, I was binge watching A Man in the High Castle. I had never really seen it, and I had been sick, and I decided to start watching it. And I got pretty far into the show. I had to stop though at a point because it got too real for me. And even though it's an alternative universe, even though it's sci-fi, it's fantasy, there's so much right now from sci-fi and dystopian, literature, movies, TV shows that is ringing so true in what's happening in the world around us. And it just became so immediately overwhelming thinking about how unprepared we are as a society for what could be coming if democracy falls in November, right? I mean, it's always had cracks. It was built with cracks. But the complete shattering and what that means to those who are really in a vulnerable situation right now. Those are things I'm thinking of when I'm watching this conversation and just wondering how things, still trying to wonder, even knowing what I try to rely on and know, still wondering what's going to happen in November and how do we make sure that people are prepared for what's happening? And how can we prepare for the unknown? It's a challenge. And we're still in the middle of a pandemic. So yeah.
And that kind of brings me to, I just want to kind of respond to what you eloquently laid out for me. But it's also that the journalistic narrative of somehow Trump being an exception, right? Which he's not, because as soon as so two things happened that I experienced in the last 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
So soon after the pandemic, happened and the lockdown was released, after the first 2 weeks, I walked down with my 3-year-old daughter in the heart of New York City, one of the most liberal places in New York. There was a young Black mother with her 3-year-old daughter literally on the corner. We were trying to get a cup of coffee. This is the first time that I've stepped out in weeks.
Yeah.
This white woman just walks up and starts questioning why this woman is there. She's doing nothing. She's just there with her daughter. And very quickly, it escalated to this woman threatening that she would call cops on this Black mother. And as a brown woman with my 4-year-old, it was painful, but also we had to rush in simply because it was our duty. But nobody else. And again, this is the heart of New York City, a couple of blocks away from NYU. And then recently, when the Black Lives Matter movement happened, my partner and my daughter were again on the streets watching the protests. They didn't protest, I went for protests. This man starts yelling racial slurs at the BLM protesters. And again, my partner is sitting there, and then, and suddenly the doorman from our building run out and grab this man and take him back into our building. And it hits us that this very man who is yelling racial slurs at protesters, at a protest that we are witnessing, lives in our building. And yes, you're right, I am still protected. But someone like you and others in the Black communities are never going to be protected, no matter how far you reach. And that brings us to the question of how Black journalists have been held to a much higher standard of reporting the Black Lives Matter movement, where they're constantly told, if you march, are you an objective reporter anymore? And I kind of want to, I kind of want you to respond to this because you are doing some phenomenal reporting at Prism, and tell me this struggle of this mainstream narrative of the black journalist marching and what that means in terms of, because they can no longer be objective in terms of news.
I think Wesley Lowery wrote a really good piece back in June about challenging objectivity, from the lenses of as a Black reporter. I'm lucky because my first professional foray into journalism is at an outlet like Prism. The type of coverage that I do is ingrained in who Prism is and what it's doing. It's also there's a larger ecosystem around movement journalism with, folks from like Press On and Scalawag and, a lot of other organizations. I think you see a lot of that at Truthout, also, particularly in the Movement Memos podcast by Kelly Hayes. So I'm lucky to be in a particular ecosystem, right? But we're definitely at the right moment to be having this conversation and reevaluating how the way objectivity has, I think, progressed has done so like in a way like when we were talking through things like policies and stuff as an outlet. It was just really interesting the way that we would have certain policies, but then it would be noted that like in more mainstream outlets, like there are things like people would be advised that they should not vote, right, or things of that nature. Like, but that is something from like a dominant mainstream viewpoint, that there are some things that are taken to be like objective because that's how it relates to your personal framing and world. But is that really objectivity, right? Like objectivity as an abstract concept makes a lot of sense. But when we're not acknowledging that there are biases, there are assumptions that are being made. I mean, going back to the debate, the conversation framing of those questions, the framing of the categories to begin with, right? The fact that the category was race and violence, as if it's race that is violence instead of white supremacy and white nationalism that's violent, right? And like the issue in those instances isn't race per se, right? As if, because when we talk about race issues, then we're talking about all the rest of us. But like when we're talking about like this high level violence that is happening, I mean, the country itself is violent. Whether we're talking about at home or abroad, and the way it has intervened. I mean, the way we're seeing and way we have seen interventions and the way we're seeing interventions happening in our communities at home are things that, we know generally have happened in other instances for the various rationalizations provided, but in other countries abroad. And so it is really interesting to, talk with and see the way other journalists at more traditional outlets cover things. And I think part of that is this moment that we're seeing. The LA Times recently just put out a huge spread about its own history of white supremacy and racial injustice, right, internal to the newsroom. And it'll be interesting to see how one of the largest papers in the country does continue to proceed with the way in which it does and tells journalism. I have a colleague who talks about reading the LA Times as a young Latina in the area, hoping to see some glimmer of them in the papers and never doing so. I mean, I know the same feeling growing up in both New York and Chicago, not really seeing anything that reflected my existence other than when it was something negative, right? I mean, and we've seen that. I mean, and other folks have seen this too, right? I just even think back to the way in which people have covered and treated things post 9/11. I think we can look at like a shift, another shift post 9/11. Because there has been, like, even in the way we cover folks who exist outside of what is considered American, and that is expanding constantly. And now under this president, basically everyone else who wants to address issues of racial insensitivity, which I hate that word, but racial insensitivity, his attacks on critical race theory. I mean, we heard it the other night. It's not simply that he thinks these policies are, it's not simply that he thinks the policies are un-American or anti-American. All of us who recognize these challenges and issues that are ingrained into the system are un-American and anti-American. And while this is not a new phenomenon for many of us, this is something that's being said. I mean, it's he's saying the loud parts out. He's saying the quiet parts out loud, right? I'm tired of that phrase. We say it so much now, but it's so true. There's so much that was like under the system. There was so much that folks of color, I think back to Black journalists, Black organizers, like Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells. There's so many people who have come before. You had papers like the Chicago Defender. I mean, tons of, there's this whole history of people saying what was obviously happening in America, but then like, you know, people would fake about decorum and respect, and if this is America and it's democracy, and that can never happen. Well, we're now really seeing that the project of America has given us a Donald Trump presidency, and we're seeing all of the things that have been like kept under the surface that a lot of people didn't pay attention to very plainly. And so I think the other part of the challenge, and I don't think that this is necessarily our responsibility as journalists of color necessarily, but I think the other challenge is getting people to understand the deeper systemic relationship. Because, you know, whether if Trump being out of office is your goal, that's not going to solve all these other issues that you've now said you cared about for the past 3 months, right? The other part I would say to what you're asking about, like Black journalists, like I have been digging more into like the history and work of Ida B. Wells in particular, because of my work with electoral justice and, you know, commitments to being aligned with various, you know, movements and struggles. And so what does that look like? And trying to figure out what does an alternative model look like to what has been the standard bearer model of journalism. I mean, looking at some of her older work and learning more about how she wasn't just, you know, people are talking about, oh, she was a suffragist, she fought for the right to vote. Yes. And like our modern, like her modern counterparts, the right to vote was a tool, right? It was a part of how to move people to action, how to move the needle on particular issues. I stumbled across this pamphlet she wrote in 1910 about how to use enfranchisement to prevent or to stop lynchings, right? And that was so poignant. And she gives an example of this organizing they did around newly registered Black voters to get them to vote in the first Black man in the Illinois legislature back in, I think it was like 1906 or so, somewhere around those early 1900s, y'all. But she did all of that. And he did, in fact, in his first year, introduce legislation that was ultimately passed and signed into law that was like an anti-mob rule. So while it was not quite anti-lynching, it still had some provisions and steps in there that which was considered a big success by Wells and others at that time period, right? And she was just using this as an instructive tool. And so we have blueprints already in process from our predecessors. Now, the problem is because we exist often in these dominant structures within, you know, journalism, we can't necessarily move in particular ways. But I think that this is a moment, if folks are comfortable and willing to do so, where people could probably shift the nature of the way their coverage is happening.
I really want to go and discuss an essay that you wrote about connecting beyond the height of emergency. You write that community defense is about organizing for long-term security, not just for immediate crisis. Um, Walk us through this idea of not just responding or reacting to the moment, but thinking long-term.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it, you know, with what we saw in Minneapolis in particular, and this has actually been happening in a lot of different places. I mean, people don't necessarily, because it's not highlighted the same way. And if you don't know the street journalists to follow, you might not know what's going on. But, you know, in protests in DC, they have been feeding people, you know, at protests daily for, we're at 100 or something days now, right? We've seen similar things going on in like Louisville. There have been different things going on here in Atlanta, in Dallas, multiple places. But in Minneapolis, since that is where this all started in terms of this current summer, now fall of uprisings and protests. In Minneapolis, you saw this idea of like people really being close and in community and making sure, because there was so much going on, that the folks in their immediate neighborhoods were safe. I think it also is a similar idea to Mia Birdsong wrote a book earlier this year, How We Show Up, which reimagines our relationships with the other people in community. And just thinking about, in our interview, Mia and I were just talking through like how at the start of the pandemic, it became really important to know the people in her immediate neighborhood. I mean, social distancing, all that, but just in case, because it was so uncertain of what was going on, because you did have high risk people, you know, with health issues, and just making sure that people were taking care of each other. And so, and there has been a mutual aid organizing periodically with hurricanes and things like that. And like going back to 2017, when Hurricane Maria happened, I got to travel with a group of folks who had been doing mutual aid work in Puerto Rico back in like December of 2017 to touch base with some of the communities they had been in. And so in that conversation and in that experience of looking and getting to know people in communities in Humacao, in Louisa, in several different places, and who were continuing to engage in this community self-reliant model in a way that even though they still did not have power, they had not had like really clear direct government, support, their communities were still able to further on. And so I wondered at that time, what would it look like to have mutual aid on a sustainable, long-term process? We fast forward back to Minneapolis, and I got an opportunity to write this piece. It's a collaborative piece between our outlet Prism and The Forge, which is an organizing magazine, about like some of the organizing that was happening beyond like what people were saying about the protests, because I think that's another part of the coverage problem is people are seeing these instances in the protests, and oftentimes the media focuses on what is the most inflammatory. Even if it's not representative of the whole thing, they'll highlight and amplify. We just saw the Black reporter in Kenosha step down from his job because of this very exact thing. They'll highlight something that's viewed as inflammatory, and then that characterizes and colors the entire body of work that is going on, and then misinforms an entire country, right? And so it was really powerful to be able to learn more about what had also been transpiring in Minneapolis, and getting to know more about how the communities, how neighborhoods were starting to show up for each other, and this citywide commitment and political organizing that was going on around defund the police. And what did that mean if people were going to make commitments to, yes, we're going to be safe and secure as a community, but we're not going to reinforce, negative harm, such as calling police on our neighbors when things are going wrong, right? And so there's some conversation in there about that. But then I got to talk to an organizer with Take Action Minnesota about, like, from their own experience, how this was actually playing out. And there were some really interesting thoughts there, because regardless of what opinion polls say about these issues, when people are engaging, talking more about defund the police, it requires these types of conversations in community for folks to understand, because they're very real feelings that people have about, security and safety, and that we do have, the reality of the world around us. And so if all they're seeing from the news is that there are no options, nobody's thought this through very well, when that's not actually the case. So it's been helpful. It was helpful to learn more about how people, and it's not been perfect, but it's been helpful to learn more about how people were talking through this. What did it look like alternatively? What were the conversations and considerations people were having? And it just felt important, because we are in this prolonged moment because of the pandemic, because of a lot of the heightened awareness and fear around the election. We're in this very prolonged moment of organizing, of angst, and it can, without some direction, without some understanding, and even without some, like, highlights and high points to point to, it can be overwhelming and cause people to check out even more. And so, and just thinking about, how we connect beyond emergency, getting people to think outside of that survival mode, because when we start thinking long term, we're able to dream, envision, and make better, more sound choices in theory. We'll see if it works in practice. But that was like the thought behind that article, and kind of the connections that we were making.
So one of the things that I really wanted to ask you is, as brown communities, sometimes all brown communities have not been in complete solidarity with the Black communities. As a brown woman, I have to acknowledge the anti-Black racism that is also. This is not to take away from some remarkable brown activists and organizers who work as allies, but that should not take away from the fact that brown communities inherently also carry anti-Black racism, which also means that as a brown woman, I am perhaps white adjacent, and I also benefit from the same structures of white supremacy that benefit white people. Now, what are the things that, as brown communities, or as brown folks with some privilege, what can we do in terms of supporting a movement that is led by folks like you and others who are constantly on the front line of this fight?
I think it's really interesting, right? Like, I think there are different ways in which the system negatively impacts, discriminates, and contributes to marginalization of our various communities, right? And there's definitely points of overlap. And I think it takes, time and engagement to learn more about where they are, right? And I appreciate the framing and asking. And it was just really interesting when you were just talking about that. Like, one of the things I was thinking about is just the relationship, um, just the relationship that we have all had in various ways to a colonial system that still is very much in effect, despite despite the fact that, with the exception of a few places, it's not technically a thing, right? Like my dad's side of family comes from the Caribbean, and you think about the hierarchy in the British Empire and the way in which various people were, leveraged in terms of that and proximity and access. And even though the United States wasn't one of the European countries that had that in that same way, the relationships, I was looking at my great grandmother's paperwork from when she came through Ellis Island, which is also really interesting. The fact that, part of my family came through Ellis Island and part of my family came here on slave ships, right? So that's just been something interesting to process as well. My family from Ellis Island also got to the islands on slave ships as well, but in different time periods. And then I was just thinking about the ways in which there are systems that are inherently built within white supremacy, because this is how white supremacy maintains its power. I saw someone share a post, and they were like, one of the heads of the Proud Boys is, this is the head of the Proud Boy. He's a brown person. So there can't be white supremacy. And that's like so fallacious. And saying that there are systems of white supremacy or people, further white supremacy, it often does come up in contentious conversations, but there are a lot of ways that, a lot of innocuous ways that, because of the way the systems and structures are set up, that we do continue to buy into and still fuel things, whether that's our intention, right? And I think when you're asking, like, what can people do? And I think for all of us, we can start to be more aware of the ways in which that we feed into and contribute to the current system. But also, start learning, like, how can we help dismantle, at least in our own world and spaces, like some of those issues in ways that we're organizing and engaging. I mean, looking at like some of it's even just political education, and not in the I think scary, communist way people might envision, being mandated to go to political education camps, and just thinking like, that stereotype that pops in people's minds, but just really taking the time to just engage and understand, and listen, because it can be uncomfortable. I mean, it can be uncomfortable. Again, we all have stuff. I mean, I remember being in a space years ago, and it was my first time experiencing something, and I don't consider myself a rude person. I don't consider myself a lot of different things, but my personal privilege in that moment showed up in a way that I was thankfully told about myself with probably more grace and respect than I deserved at the moment. And that has been a learning, moment for me. And so we all have those moments and spaces when that happens. But I do think when we're talking about like larger scale issues, even being able to have those open conversations with our friends and family when something comes up. I mean, I think that's like really important, as well. And how we raise our children, I mean, my kids, hopefully when they're a little older, they're teenagers, and so they're cranky and nothing I do is right. But hopefully someday when they're older, they will recognize the moments and opportunities we try to take in their upbringing. And so, I mean, I really do think a lot of it just has to like how we're willing to shift, beyond our personal zones of comfort to understand and engage more about particular issues. And I'm not saying that everyone has to join reading book clubs and things of that nature, because we also are busy people. But is there a cool podcast that can be, checked out to understand more, or a show like yours where people can just tune in, for a little bit in between whatever else they have going on, to just kind of plug in some more. And so I think that's what we need. We need a commitment to, plugging in a bit more, and not just the escapism that sometimes allows us to be blind to other people's experiences, and which later turns to uncaring.
And since we're already on the 43-minute mark, I want to ask you questions. And this is something I asked Anjali as well, is what do we do leading up to this moment? How do we plan for the future? How are you thinking about the future? Because for me, it's going to be years of fight. Not just fighting to go back to the status quo, but fighting for something infinitely better. So, what are you thinking about, and how do we build for the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things we've definitely seen, especially with this pandemic experience, has been how woefully unprepared, not just individuals are. It's so much more than that, right? The country as a whole has been hard hit in this moment. And we have a system that benefits itself and not the people within it, right? And there are a lot of things that could be done that are putting us first, versus a lot of the decisions and stuff that we've seen. And so, what I think is really important, for those who have multiple elections on the ballot coming up, I mean, I think voting is an important way that we can take a step, right, towards getting things on track. However, it is not the only thing. It is not the absolute end all be all. There needs to be like a voting and conversation we're having with ourselves and other people, and not a vote shaming conversation, because I think we've also had a lot of people, because of their own experiences or they're just very strong viewpoints, whatever it may be, that have decided to check out of the civic engagement process. And part of that is, though, on the lands at the feet of those who take ownership of ushering and facilitating, managing our democracy. We have not had real coordinated engagement across the board. And so we've seen instances where government actually makes it more difficult for people to participate in the process, whether it's even in fulfilling open records requests. I mean, we've seen ways that government has actually been a barrier to people's participation when it's supposed to be encouraging and making that something that should be. So I think having a commitment and having like a solid commitment with a tentative plan for how to be more involved beyond casting your ballot in this election. I think for this upcoming election, folks can definitely volunteer. There are several different voting rights and civic engagement organizations all across the country. I tend to advise people to do that type of, getting your feet wet type of thing, whether you're making a push to the last couple of days of voter registration. Our dates and deadlines vary, but it's right about now. Or if you're encouraging folks with good verifiable information about voting, whether it's how to vote by mail, or you're talking about voting early in person, people insist on voting in person and being masked up at the polls. I mean, I think sharing good verifiable information goes such a long way, considering the scourge that is disinformation and how it plays into not just giving people the wrong information when they're going to make decisions, but in some ways it can make people feel so overwhelmed that they don't even involve in the process. And so I think those are some things that people can really do right now. And then I just really think talking to the people in your immediate circle, your family and friends who, get 5, get 10 people and have them commit to taking a particular action. Once people have more steps and understand like what is possible, I think we'll see more people willing to step and engage. And again, like I've known a lot about different things, but I really didn't know as much until the opportunity hit me in 2014 when I was going through one of what was the most stressful disaster of my life before the pandemic. So I mean, I just think, having a commitment to be more civically engaged and making this a part of our way of life and not just simply something we do on a checkbox every 4 years, and paying attention to what's going on at your state and local level. A lot of the decisions that we're seeing made right now around pandemic about whether or not we will have, certain things happening for the election are decisions that are being made at the local level. So we need to be more cognizant and aware. And I know it's tough because I know people are managing a lot. And then we're also managing a lot during a crisis. And so, find your way and do what you can, but you don't have to be Superman and try to save us all. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anoa. You can read more of Anoa Changa's work at Prism. Prism is also a BIPOC-led not-for-profit journalism platform. So one of the other things that we could do, and all of us must do, is support these incredible organizations that continue to bring you news, information, and analysis. Anoa, thank you so much. And I really appreciate this conversation, and I learned so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.